We're starting a little bit late, but obviously there was a breakfast out just outside of our committee room. Committee, are there any bill introductions this morning? All right, so no bill introduction. So we're going to go ahead and move on to a briefing on the Legislative Task Force on Community and Technical College report. And so I'd ask Brianna Horton with the Kansas Legislative Research Department to give us a briefing. Brianna?
Good morning, Chair. Good morning, Committee. I'm Brianna Horton with KLRD. I'm going to give you guys a briefing of this report, and I would just like to preface that I was not with KLRD when this committee happened, so I will do my best to answer the questions as they come. So the committee was charged to study the provisions of the state funding to the community and technical colleges under the 2022 Appropriations Bill, Section 109G. I'm going to flip to. I'm going to skip past the recommendations to get to that last and go to this page right here. This is background. So the task force is composed of 13 members, representatives and senators. And then there are 3 members representing the community colleges, 2 members representing the technical colleges, and a member from the Kansas Board of Regents. The provisions state that the legislative intent for fiscal year 2024 is to implement the funding formula for community and technical colleges concerning the post-secondary tiered technical education state aid and non-tiered course credit hours grant so that community and technical colleges that were overfunded according to the formula in fiscal year 2023 will receive 50% of the amount of the overfunding in fiscal year 2024. So we're going to move down to the committee activities. So the committee met for 2 days in 2022. There was an approved meeting for 2 days, and then they met on August 30th. The majority of the meeting was comprised of the task force members discussing formula-related issues. And then we're going to move down to the funding model. So funding for both provisions of the general education and technical courses is determined by using the cost model required by state law. Funding for the technical education takes into account additional costs to deliver those courses. And if we flip on over to the back, the cost calculation model is based on numerous factors and is set by KBOR. The non-tiered course credit hour grant amount is also set by KBORs. The Assistant Revisor of Statutes noted that appropriations from fiscal year 2023 to the tiered $66 million and non-tiered $95 million. Additionally, the legislator directed KBOR to distribute funding in fiscal year 2023 so that each institution would receive no less than what they had received in fiscal year 2022, with the directive that by 2025, the funding formula will be fully implemented. And then we're going to scooch on down to the calculations. For every tiered course, 4 factors determine the cost rate: instructor's cost, instructional support cost, institutional cost, and extraordinary cost for equipment and infrastructure. For non-tiered courses, they have 3 factors for course rates, which includes instructor cost, instructional support cost, and institutional support costs. The course rate is then multiplied by the number of eligible students to calculate the course total. So the committee discussed the overfunding of the community and technical colleges and the proviso to balance that funding. So the underfunded colleges will receive full funding and the overfunded colleges will receive funding according to that funding formula. The proviso requiring each institution to receive no less than state funding aid than what they had received in the previous year. They also discussed the increase for fiscal year 2023 tiered and non-tiered appropriations by the legislatures and the provisos creating that recentering of funding process so that all the colleges, of course, are funded to the formula in fiscal year 2025. They discussed the Excel in career technical educations under Senate Bill 155, and they discussed that the 3 main funding sources of community colleges are local property taxes, tuition, and state aid. The technical colleges operate on 2 main funding sources, which is tuition and state aid. So we're going to go to the performance agreements. So the performance agreements are given to the Board of Regents from the universities. K-Board's charged with supervising performance measures, and the colleges were asked to develop institutional improvement plans showing how the performance indicators will be implemented and measured by each school. So if you flip over to the back, we're going to get into those performance measures. 3 of the measures are chosen by each college from a list that was provided by the Board of Regents, and the other 3 measures are created by each college, and the school must meet 4 of those 6 requirements. And then we're going to get into the residency requirements. So the basic requirement for Kansas students, residency is to live in the state of Kansas for 6 months prior to enrollment. There are some exceptions for military when it comes to that requirement. Students who were living in Kansas at graduation of high school or 12 months prior, or persons recruited for employment may be considered for the residence state aid purposes. For community and technical colleges, the revisor reviewed some factors that technical colleges can consider when determining residency, including payment of Kansas income taxes, ownership of a home, and registration to vote. The committee specifically discussed technical colleges that do not count students who drive from another state as residents for purposes of the state aid, but if students choose to move and reside in Kansas in the dorm or apartment, then they are considered residents. So this was a brief overview of the discussions. I'm going to flip back to this gray page right here so we can go over the recommendations that the committee discussed. Chunks of them are with K-boards, and then some of them are with the legislator. So the task force recommends the Kansas Board of Regents use a 3-year average of data to calculate funding distributions for tiered and non-tiered education state aid rather than using a single previous year of data. The task force recommends the legislature review the statutory definition of new state money as it relates to performance agreements and consider creating a new definition. The task force urges K-boards to review the current performance agreement process and consider creating a process that incentivizes larger goals rather than punishing for not meeting metrics. The task force also recommends the legislature consider funding the 2% performance incentive that was previously underfunded. The task force recommends the legislature review and consider removing the proviso requiring funding for the Excel Career Technical Colleges Initiative. The task force recommends the legislature grant K-Board auditing authority or utilize the legislative division of post-audit process if audits are needed of data inputted by the colleges for the cost model calculation. The task force recommends the legislature review statutes related to residency requirements and review where residency requirements for technical colleges originated and consider putting such requirements in the statute. The task force recommends the legislature add reappropriation authority to tiered and non-tiered funding line items in the appropriation bill. They recommend the legislature review proviso prohibiting K-Board from transferring money between tiered and non-tiered accounts. And they recommend the legislature ensure the recentering of tiered and non-tiered education state funding occur as required in 2022 House Bill sub for SB 267. And with that, I will stand for questions.
All right, thank you, Brianna, for the synopsis of what happened in regards to the interim committee. Questions from the committee, Representative Williams.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Okay, so I need some help understanding the recommendations and how they work together. So I was very pleased that one of the recommendations is to ensure the recentering of the tiered and non-tiered. And so when we do that, then there's a schedule that outlines all the different courses and how much it costs to deliver those courses and an average cost. So that's set. But my question is, how does that relate to the request that says, I think it's bullet point 3 on the conclusions and recommendations. It said to review the current performance assessment process, which you just explained that they need to do 4 out of 6 items, and consider creating a process that incentives larger goals rather than punishing colleges for not meeting metrics. What do they mean when they state this about punishing colleges, and how does this request or recommendation fit with the recenter, ensure the recentering? And because we have a schedule, so how are they paid outside of this schedule?
Brianna?
Chairman, I will follow up and help get an answer figured out for that.
Okay.
Do you have a follow-up question? Or
Is there
comment?
is there anyone that could answer that here, that was on the committee or that might know?
I would probably say that we will try to gather that information for you on exactly what the conversation was in regards to the interim committee. Right now, I can't recollect what we actually discussed.
Okay,
And
sounds
we'll get
good. I just
information.
don't want, here the big debate has been about the recentering tiered and non-tiered, and it looks like they agree, and then you go up, and then there is conflicting information which says we don't want schools to be punished, and I would think that means monetarily because they don't meet the criteria. So, thank you.
Representative Sutton.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. And actually, we are kind of working on the conclusion and recommendation question that I had, but before that, wanted to go into, and I remember this vaguely, but maybe you could put a little bit better definition to it. Schools that were overfunded in 23, or in 23, we're correcting that. Okay, first off, overfunding, are we meaning more than we intended to fund them? Is that the definition of overfunded, or are we using a different one?
Brianna.
I believe so, Chairman.
Okay, all right, and those things happen. I'm not gonna, get all crazy over that. But the reaction to it is the part that raises my eyebrows. We overfunded in 23, and so for 24, we're not gonna do that again. Actually, we are. We're gonna overfund you, but only half as much. What's the rationalization behind this? I'm not following the logic.
Brianna.
From my understanding, the goal is to get us to back where they are currently overfunded. So the goal is to get them to where that nobody is technically overfunded, from my understanding. And I will definitely clarify. So that's why they're taking everything to make sure it's at that, I think, 50%.
Well, and that's the part that gets me. Why don't we just go back to what we intended to fund rather than continuing to overfund, but just not as much? That's what it looks like is being written here, and that confuses the heck out of me, quite honestly.
What we're going to do after Brianna is done and we are done with the questions for Brianna, we're probably going to have Heather Morgan address the committee. So some of those questions might be directed more towards Heather than the research department.
I think that sounds perfect. If I could ask one more.
You may.
Real quickly. Most of my questions did center around that funding thing because, that's the kind of guy I am. But the other one kind of touched on what Representative Williams was asking about. We have the performance measures, or at least an outline of what the performance measures are supposed to look like, must meet 4 out of 6, and we don't have those performance measures, but then under the report, the conclusions and recommendations, it says that we need to review the process for performance measures. I don't see the performance measures. What is it exactly they have to review? Is it that the performance measures didn't work out well, and so they're not included in the report, and we have to revisit? What's the problem with the current performance measures, I guess is my question, that causes us to have to revisit the performance measures?
Brianna.
Chairman, I can provide the committee with copies of the performance measures that KBORS uses for the universities so that you guys can get a little insight into what they're looking at and as to why they might have wanted to be reviewed.
Perfect. That would be lovely. All right. Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Any further questions for Brianna? Representative Tarwater.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. My question is about the residency requirements in current law. You kind of lost me when task force members discussed the differences between community colleges and technical college residence requirements. But so technical colleges don't count people that drive across the state line as in-state unless they live here. If they move here, immediately they could qualify for in-state tuition. Do they also qualify for in-state aid?
Brianna?
I can follow up and make sure I get an answer to that question.
Representative Tarwater.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
And if I recall, the discussion that we had in regards to that is there is a discrepancy between community colleges and technical colleges in regards to the residency requirements. And so in the recommendations, we were trying to have a uniform platform in regards to defining what residency meant for both, because there is that discrepancy between the two institutions. Representative Williams, again.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. So with that, that would have to be reconciled by changing statute, correct?
Correct.
Correct. And then in terms of the community college perspective versus the technical college perspective, for the benefit of the committee, when you have 18 counties that are being taxed property tax, which is pretty heavy for your community college, that's why there's this, it's not quite the same. I think your in-county may not want to pay for out-of-state students at the same rate that maybe a technical school would, because the technical school has no property tax base. So it is an issue, but.
Any further questions for Brianna? All right, seeing none, thank you very much for giving us an overview. And so now I would invite to the podium Heather Morgan, and you can give your idea of what conspired during the interim committee, and then we'll stand for questions.
I'll start with Representative Williams' question about the performance agreements versus tiered and non-tiered funding. So the way the performance agreements work, it's not like how the universities work. Every single college, community college, technical college, university has a different set of performance measures. They pick their own. It's not like every other state agency. The way that KBOR interprets new money is any money that the college didn't get the previous year is new money. So when we've been talking about some people have been over and underfunded, to Representative Sutton's question, it wasn't an accident. There was a proviso that had been on the books for about 10 years that said you get to stay where you are. So it wasn't an accident that anybody was overfunded. The concern that was brought to the committee this summer was, for example, your community college, which had been historically underfunded by quite a lot. The way that the current KBOR policy works is KBOR could retain 10% of that new money that should have been going to your college. And because it was such a large sum, because we were fixing this in equity, we didn't want there to be an opportunity for 10% to be taken. Now, the KBOR ruled on the performance agreements over the last few months. They didn't take anything from any college, community, technical, or university. So that is a little bit moot now, but that idea of new money as we are getting people paid what they're supposed to be paid, that was the concern there. So now to, I think, the second part of Representative Williams, and to your point, the committee, agreed that this year in the budget, there needs to be a proviso that will cut by 50% any of the overfunded. So we're on a glide path to next year at this time. You're going to get what you're supposed to get. It's calculated, what you're supposed to get, is based on where the student is from for community colleges. So if they're from the taxing county, we get paid, community colleges are paid 1/3 from the state, that 1/3 from the local property tax is the idea, and 1/3 from the student. Technical colleges for all students get paid 2/3 from the state, 1/3 from the student. So when we go into the residency question, community colleges students do not become resident students unless they choose to become a Kansas resident, and by statute they cannot choose to become a Kansas resident until they've been here for 6 months. There are two separate out-of-state questions here. I think Representative Williams was referencing community colleges have largely in-district, out-district, and out-of-state tuition, different rates. Technical colleges really just charge one rate, flat rate. This is the tuition and fees. So when we have technical colleges who might have dorms or athletics, which we have some, they would be getting 2/3 funding from that student, where the college down the road is getting 0 state funding for that student. And so in a way, the taxpayers of the 18 counties who are supporting their community colleges are paying a little bit more to support that 2/3 out-of-state student at a tech college when they're not getting any state aid for that, for a similarly situated student at their college. And so I think Representative Waymaster characterized it appropriately, that we were looking at whatever the rule is, making it the same across the entire 2-year sector. I think I answered all of the questions, but I'm happy to stand for more.
I know we do have one question. Representative Tarwater.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Heather, thanks for being here. When you came to the Workforce Development Committee over the interim, we talked about how quickly the community colleges can respond to the business community if the business community is the payor of the class to train their employees. And then we also talked about, in general, when the community colleges recognize that they need to change their curriculum to better match the other businesses and the rest of the community, it is a long, painstaking process to get that through the Board of Regents, so you can't act as quickly. Was that discussed at all in this interim committee?
Heather?
Not that I recall. I'll let Representative Waymaster see if he recalls differently. We only met one day, and I don't think that we did address that issue. So the rest of the committee understands community colleges can deliver courses. So for example, we're working with Panasonic and figuring out what they're going to need for training. If we do not offer the course for credit, it does not go through the tiered or non-tiered formula. We establish an agreement with the business pays us a rate, the end of story. So there's no state aid for that workforce training. So that is one of the differences. So your community college, Johnson County Community College, does about 16,000 hours of non-credit training that never runs through the formula.
I don't recall us discussing that.
I don't either, but it was a long day.
Representative Sutton.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Heather, I'd like to loop back into that. You touched on it with you said there's been a proviso for 10 years. Could you go into more detail on that? Because you later referenced people being paid more than they were supposed to and overfunding. So I want to know how in the last 10 years that has been the only area in my mind that's been funded at all, much less overfunded. So
Yeah, so
how did
let
that
me,
happen?
this is a very complex subject, and I'm going to do my best to explain it simply.
Well, keep it simple. You know who you're talking to, right?
No comment. The community and technical colleges have a certain pot of money for tiered and a certain pot of money for non-tiered. The pots together were not fully funded. So essentially the entire system was underfunded. While the entire system was underfunded, because of this proviso that was put on, for example, I'm just going to make this up, Pratt Community College did enough business, taught enough classes, and had the number of classes and number of students and all these factors came out to be $100,000. But the previous year, they received $120,000. So in order to not cut Pratt Community College's budget, the proviso said, even though you only did $100,000 worth of work, we're going to let you keep $120,000. If there was a school like Representative Williams' school, Butler, for example, they might have sent the bill to the state for $500,000, but because both buckets were underfunded, they only got $200,000 back from the state, even though they sent a $500,000 bill. So last year, you guys made a heavy lift and said, we're going to fully fund the buckets. Now, the second step of that is people who are getting more than they're supposed to are going to get half of it this year. Next year, it's all fixed. So we're on a 3-year pace to fix a decades-old problem. I hope that makes sense.
Representative Sutton.
I think that does. I'm not sure I agree with the cure. I'm not sure why we would have to phase it in, but at least I understand what's happening here, and so that makes it a whole lot more palatable. Thank you very much, and thank you, Mr. Chair.
Thank you.
Representative Williams.
Well, just real quick, just for the benefit of my colleague, I think the day we had the major battle in here last year, you weren't here. But it was a major firestorm, and it wasn't the first time. Right. And it wasn't the first time we had the firestorm in here. We had it 2 years prior as well. So it is a little bit complicated. I'd love to talk to you later about it.
Representative Torwater.
I'm sorry, Mr. Chairman, I just wanted a little clarification. So I think part of the problem was that those colleges they didn't have the number of students, and they didn't have the, I guess, maybe proper classes, for lack of a better word. If they make changes and their curriculum changes and they have more students, they won't be cut, right?
Right, so it's a really good question. So hopefully, I'm praying, frankly, we will know very soon, I want to know in the next week if possible, the rates and your student mix and the course mix all determines what you're supposed to be paid. So for example, if you had a nursing program, and then for whatever reason you halted your nursing program and then you restarted it, that can swing the amount of money that the state owes you significantly, like $250,000 or $300,000. So the KBOR, unfortunately, it's always during the session, and it's after the governor's budget, comes up with what they call the gap spreadsheet. And the gap spreadsheet says, based upon what you currently get, are you getting, if you got that number again, what are you overfunded or underfunded? And so if, for example, someone who thought when we left after the firestorm last year, if they thought they were going to get a $1.5 million cut and their course mix changed or they added programs, it's very likely that they may not get that cut. They may only get $1 million cut or something. So we won't know that until we see that spreadsheet. I haven't seen it. I don't think anybody else has seen it. But once we have that, Representative Howe will have a lot of sorting out to do to make sure we get the right proviso in that says, whatever anybody's at, you're going to get a 50% cut.
And actually, we do have a copy of that gap spreadsheet, last year's.
Yeah.
And so we're going to pass that out. So the committee members have the financial information. So we're going to have that distributed out to the committee members. So.
Thank you all. And if you have any other questions, I'm happy to come to your office and explain this very complex subject.
All right. Thank you for being here, Heather. We're going to go ahead and move on to the next item on the agenda, and then as an update on the American Rescue Plan Act money grants that we distributed last year in the budget bill for higher education basically in response to economic development. And so I'd ask Rachel Willis, the Director of Legislative Affairs for the Kansas Department of Commerce. Welcome to committee, Rachel.
Good morning, Chairman and committee members. My name is Rachel Willis. I'm the Director of Legislative Affairs for the Department of Commerce. So thank you for giving me the opportunity to provide you an update on higher education funding through ARPA. So as you remember, in 2022, House Bill 2510 and Senate Bill 267, the Kansas Department of Commerce was allocated $233 million for higher education institutions in the American Rescue Plan Act, or the ARPA funding. These funds were initially allocated to the Office of the Governor, and then the Office of the Governor designated Commerce as the administrating agency. So since then, Commerce has worked in collaboration with the Office of Recovery to ensure that these awards are made in such a way that it complies with, of course, all the federal regulations and applicable guidelines. So as part of this process, we have issued guidelines and application instructions to the intended recipients, informing them about the way the distributions would be made. We've also hosted webinars and one-on-one meetings with recipients to provide that technical assistance regarding all the necessary documentation that, again, is required by federal law. Each recipient has received these full instructions, which also include the details surrounding the matching fund requirements and eligible use of funds. Lastly, the projects must show an opportunity for success, and they must complete a risk assessment questions. So to date, the recipients are receiving their award agreements and initial disbursements for their allocated amounts respected to their approved projects. And as projects get underway, all recipients will be required to submit quarterly reports that detail the expenditures that occur throughout the completion of their projects. So now I'll go into the different buckets of allocation. So first, the Regent Universities. This allocation total was $100 million. The University of Kansas, K-State University, Fort Hays State University, and Emporia State University all have received approval for their submitted projects. Each institution is in the process of having their award agreements drafted, which again include all that necessary documentation to meet those federal regulations. It includes approved budgets, timelines, and again, the conditions of disbursement. So we anticipate having these agreements fully executed and initial disbursements processed by the end of the month, if not sooner. Also in this allocation budget, or bucket is Pittsburgh State University, which is still currently being reviewed, but it is again anticipated to follow the similar timeline as far as the award agreement execution and disbursement of initial funds, so by the end of this month. The joint project for Wichita State University and the University of Kansas's Health Science Education Center, that they're working together in cooperation with both of those universities, so there has to be a memo of agreement between the universities, then we'll work on their grant agreement. But again, we're anticipating meeting those same kind of timelines with that. Lastly, it's important to note the disbursements under this allocation budget or bucket. The disbursements will be made in 25% increments upon verification and acceptance of their documented expenditures from that previous disbursement. Recipients are requested to have their funds fully expended by June 30th of 2024, and there are, of course, possible extensions on a case-by-case basis, but the deadline is no later than June 30th, 2026, which is designated by federal law. There is no match requirement for this allocation. Next up is the Washburn University allocation, which was $3 million. Washburn has received approval for their submitted project, and again, we are composing their award agreement with identical requirements of those with the Regent University, so everything that I just shared before. And we anticipate, again, having this agreement fully executed and their initial disbursement by the end of January. So specifically, again, their disbursements will be made in 25% increments, and they are expected to have their funds spent by June 30th of 2024, with the possibility of extensions no later than June 30th of 2026, and there are no matching funds required for this one. Next, Wichita State University Digital Transformation Center was allocated $10 million. The Office of Recovery has maintained those funds and is overseeing the administration of that. So we'll move along to the community and technical colleges. That bucket is $45.4 million. And hot off the press, so updated from our written testimony, 13 of the 22 community and technical colleges have received allocations for their approved submitted projects. So working hard on getting those out the door. So again, reviewing award agreements with all the necessary documentation. So making sure that we're meeting those federal guidelines, approving budgets, project timelines, and again, conditions for disbursement. So we anticipate having all of this executed and those initial disbursements out by the end of the month. 9 community and technical colleges have yet to provide sufficient documentation, so we are corresponding with those folks on a daily basis to provide them with that technical assistance and guidance to make sure to get those approved and out the door. This bucket of funding does require a 1-to-1 match, and those funds have to come from non-state monies or donated equipment. So with the donated equipment, the evaluation of the equipment has to be calculated through a recent bill of sale or appraisal by a county appraiser's officer or a registered appraiser with the state of Kansas. The first disbursement of funding is 50% of the award, and it will be distributed once the institution has confirmed 50% of its matching funds. The remaining disbursements will be provided again upon expenditure of all allocated and matching dollars from that first disbursement, and the confirmation of the remaining matching dollars has been received. Recipients are requested to have these funds fully spent by June 30th of 2024, again with the possible extensions on a case-by-case basis. Okay, moving on next to the private and independent colleges. This allocation was $10 million. 11 of the 23 allocations for private and independent colleges have been approved for their submitted projects. Again, we're in the process of having those award agreements drafted and making sure that we have all the required documentation, approved budgets, timelines, and the conditions for disbursement. We anticipate having these fully executed and their initial disbursements out the door by the end of this month, so the end of January. 9 of the 23 have yet to provide, again, sufficient documentation for project approval. So again, we're corresponding with these folks on a daily basis to answer their questions and provide that technical assistance and guidance to get their projects approved so we can move forward as quickly as possible. It is important to note within this allocation bucket, there are 3 that have declined funding for this program. Central Baptist, Theological Seminar, Mid-America Nazarene University, and Sterling College have all declined. So the department is researching allowable uses of this funding that follow both the legislative intent as well as federal guidelines. Okay, then lastly is the University Challenge Grants. $75 million was allocated towards this program. The Department of Commerce has accepted applications. The application window has closed, and we are now in the review process. Notifications of those awards by law are required on or before June 30th of 2023. And then all projects have to be completed by September 30th, 2026 for this particular allocation. And it does require a 3-to-1 match. So at this time, I will stand for questions.
All right, thank you very much, Rachel. So the first question I have in regards to the $100 million that was allocated for the regions, and we have KU, K-State, Fort Hays, and Emporia.
Yes.
Can you elaborate on what the projects are or what they're looking at in those particular universities?
Sure. Specifically, KU is looking at a new campus gateway, a multi-use facility to host conventions and events, and then upgrades to an athletic facility. K-State is looking at new construction for a farm research and innovation center, a new global center for grain and food innovation, as well as a livestock competition area and horse unit. Fort Hays is doing improvements to their Coliseum. Emporia is relocating their Department of Nursing from off campus to a new site on campus. Wichita State and KU, that collaboration project is, they're working on the development of a health centers education center there in Wichita. So those are the approved projects.
All right, thank you very much. And then,
Yep.
So going to page 3 of your testimony with the private and independent colleges, and you said that there was the declination from some of the private schools of the funds. Mm-hmm. Was there any rationale as to why they declined the funds that were allocated?
Yeah, so 2 of them have indicated to us that they can't meet the match requirement. And then the third proposed a project that wasn't eligible, specifically wanting to use the funding for scholarships, and that's not an allowable expense according to the federal guidelines.
And so since this is ARPA money and they have declined the funding, I guess my question is, how is that going to be reallocated? Or do we have to make any type of legislative action to have it reallocated someplace else?
It's a good question, and internally discussions continue to evolve, and I think that we're primarily looking at potentially hosting a competitive grant round with those additional dollars.
All right, thank you. Representative Williams.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. In regard to the projects that were just shared to us, could we get a breakdown of those projects by the region schools and the costs for each?
Yes.
You,
yeah,
I mean, not
think-
today, but it could be sent to us?
Yep.
Okay, great. And then the other question is, there are several categories that have to provide a one-to-one match,
Mm-hmm.
whether it's the community and technical colleges and the independent colleges. I didn't see reference to a match for the regions. Did they have to provide a match for the 185 million that they received?
Rachel.
Yes, the Regents, no match was required on that 100 million.
Is there a rationale for no match for the 185 million, but matches for the 55.4 million?
So just to clarify, so that Regent bucket was 100 million. So are you combining that with the university challenge
I'm
grant?
combining, yes, the challenge grant as well as the $10 million for Wichita State Digital Transformation Center.
Okay. So the university challenge grant does require a match. It's a 3-to-1. So I don't think that was maybe noted in the written testimony. So my apologies there. And then the others, that, to my understanding, that was indicated in state law in those budget bills.
But
so
do
that
we
was-
have a rationale why some schools are required to provide a match, but our region schools do not have to? I understand that it was put in statute, but was there a
Yeah.
reason there the difference was?
Not that I was privy to any of those conversations, no. So
And I think when, from the legislative perspective, we have so many things going through our budget. I think I just failed to make the connection that some are required to provide a match and some are not. And that doesn't seem to be very fair. And then my last question is on the distribution. So if you take the 185 million and the 45.4 and then the 10 million, how was the distribution determined? Was it based on enrollment in all of these different schools, or how was it determined that community colleges get this amount, independent this amount, regions get 185?
Rachel.
sorry. To my understanding, that those were conversations that the legislature had, and not necessarily anything that we dictated. We're just following what was in those two budget bills.
So perhaps arbitrary, because I don't recall us talking about enrollment numbers, but maybe we did, or rationale for the distribution. So that would fall on me too, because I don't recall that. But just the final comment is that in your testimony, you said to date the recipients are receiving awarded agreements, and then you also said that corresponding in a daily, you're contacting your potential recipients that haven't fulfilled all the obligations every day. That is completely different than what we heard yesterday from the Department of Recovery. So thank you from the Department of Commerce that you actually are expending this amount of money versus the 300 some million yesterday we heard about which is still sitting on the shelf. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you. I can't take any of the credit personally. Jonathan Clayton, my colleague, absolutely can.
Representative Owens. Right. Representative Hoffman.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. You said that one of the independents did not qualify because they're they were going to use it for financial aid.
Sorry.
Is that correct?
Rachel.
Yes, so they had proposed their project to use the funding for scholarships, and that is not an eligible use under the federal guidelines.
Have you showed them the regs, the federal regs that
My
understanding is that they said they were never given the actual federal reg that showed that.
Okay, all right. Like I said, Jonathan Clayton and his small but mighty team will definitely follow up.
Okay.
And we'll get that resolved.
All right, thank you.
Are there any other questions for Rachel? Representative Sutton.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I think my major questions have already been covered, but I am curious with regard to the Wichita State University Digital Transformation Center. What's going on with that? Has there been disbursement? Are there plans? Have they submitted documentation? What's going on with that?
Rachel.
Yeah, Representative, I apologize. I don't have any information on that. That's all within the Office of Recovery.
Well, okay. I'll have to talk to them.
Yeah.
Excellent. Thank you.
You had
Thank
your
Mr. Chair.
opportunity yesterday. Representative Helgerson.
It sounds like most of the proposals are capital improvements or a good deal of the money, one-time capital improvements. Were there performance measures attached with the rest of the projects?
Rachel.
That's a good question. I'm not for sure on the reporting requirements details, other than those are coming in quarterly once those projects start. So I can follow up with you after I have a conversation with Jonathan and let you know
Representative Helgerson.
specifically.
Okay, so if you could follow up whether or not there's performance measures, but also in one or two examples where there were capital improvements or in other categories, it looks like there will be a need for annual update or maintenance. If you have a capital improvement, you build such a facility or a building, then somewhere there's going to be some needed staffing and or other maintenance requirements. Did the institution say how they're going to pay for those costs?
Rachel.
Again, another really great question regarding sustainability, right, of those new facilities, and I'm not for sure, so I will follow up. I'll also just say to your previous point, we do absolutely on I guess a best practice standpoint require performance metrics when we are allocating funds. So again, I'll get you those details.
Thank you very much.
Any other further questions for Rachel? All right, seeing none, thank you for being here.
Thank you.
Committee, we're going to go ahead and circle back to the initial item that we had on the agenda for bill introductions. So Representative Hoffman.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I apologize. I have a bill introduction, 23 RS 0398. It is some technical fixes to the Promise Act.
All right, committee, you've heard the bill introduction. Is there a second? Seconded by Representative Helgerson. Discussion, Representative Ballard.
Just a clarification, please. When you said the Promise Act, I'm sorry, back up a little bit and tell me a little bit more about the Promise Act.
Representative Hoffman.
Yeah, the Promise Act, we I don't know, it's been 2 years now, I think. It's the one that's the last in scholarship for two-year colleges, or, you know, to fully fund a student if after they've have already exceeded other grants or scholarships, and we come in the last and pick up the tuition for them for certain technical degrees.
Thank you for that. I thought maybe it was, but I wasn't sure. Thank you.
Any other questions? All right, all those in favor of the bill introduction say aye. Aye. Opposed? Bill is introduced. Any other items or bill introductions? All right, so committee, obviously we're not going to be meeting tomorrow, and we are not going to be meeting on Monday. And then on Tuesday, the agenda is going to be an update on the Built Up Kansas and from the Department of Transportation, specifically in regards to the Ike Transportation Plan. As I mentioned before, I will not be here on Tuesday, so Vice Chair Hoffman will be in charge of the committee. Also, to let everybody know, we will be starting the budget report outs on February 6th, which happens to be a Monday. So that's going to be the start of us having the 5-day work week. We're going to start meeting on February 6th and having budget report outs every single day until approximately March 10th. So that's going to be the start, and we're going to be meeting every day, Monday through Friday, starting on February 6th. So until Tuesday, we are adjourned.